You can cry on command.
But they are usually very fast, and that is why I decided to create this. Welcome to Free Talk, the show to help you learn English the fun and simple way. Ready? Hello and welcome to the episode 0 of Free Talk's podcast. My name is Alan and I am the creator of Free Talk. Before we start anything, I would like to say two things to you. Number one, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Maybe you are coming to this podcast because you finished the Free Talks free course, or you visited my webpage www.freetalkenglish.com and you saw the podcast section and now you are here. Or maybe a friend recommended this podcast to you. Whatever the reason, you are here, and for that, thank you very much. And number two, I want to say congratulations. Because if you are here right now, that only means one thing, that you are serious about your English learning because you want to take your language to the next level. And trust me, this is the perfect podcast for you. Now, in this podcast, we have one objective, and the principal objective of this podcast is to give you listening material that is comprehensible and interesting. And to make that possible, we are going to work together. My responsibility is to make this podcast comprehensible. How am I going to do that? Well, I am going to speak in English at a normal speed. The velocity of my speaking is not going to be very slow, like the teachers in the classroom. And it's not going to be very fast, like the people in the television or in the streets. I am going to speak at a normal speed, the normal speed that I use in a regular conversation, so that you can really understand everything. Also, if I say something that maybe I think that you can understand, because it's a very difficult word or a strange expression, I am going to pause, I am going to stop what I am saying, and I will explain that word to you. Okay? So everything is going to be completely understandable. Now, how are we going to make this podcast interesting? Well, to do that, I am going to need your help. In this podcast, we are going to discuss a lot of different topics. For example, one week we can talk about sports, the next about science, the next about video games. We don't have any restrictions. We will talk about everything. And I will need your help. If you have any idea about what you would like to listen in this podcast, just let me know. Send me a message using Twitter or Facebook or my website, www.freetalkenglish.com, or send me an email and we are going to make the podcast about the topics that you are interested in. So now we are going to have a podcast that is comprehensible and interesting. This podcast is not about me. This podcast is about you. You have the power to decide what you want to listen. Now, in this first episode, in this episode 0, I will also tell you how this podcast is going to work, how this podcast is structured. This podcast is divided in 3 sections. On the first section, we are going to discuss the main topic of the podcast. We are going to use the most part of every episode to talk about it. Now, you should know that I am not an expert in everything, obviously. So, of course, the things that I will say will be mostly general information and maybe some of my opinions about it. But that is a good thing, I think, because in this way, we will have the possibility to explore many different topics every week. Okay? I hope you like that. Now, that is the main section, the first section of this podcast. Then we have 2 other sections, 2 short sections. One of them is called A Word on Pronunciation. In this section, we are going to look at a particular aspect of English pronunciation. Maybe about the sound of some letters, or the stress or intonation. I will explain it to you and I will give you some examples so that you can practice during the week. Now, maybe you are thinking right now, but Alan, one aspect of pronunciation a week is not enough. But remember, I told you that it's better to do just a little every single day. If you listen to this podcast and you listen to it a lot of times during the week and you practice your pronunciation exercise every week, after only 1 year, you will know 52 new things about pronunciation and your English will sound so much better. Trust me, this works. You just need to be patient. And, well, that is the section number 2, the section about pronunciation. And the final section of this podcast is about you. It's about responding to your questions. If you have a question about English, maybe an expression you don't know, or something that you are not sure about, or maybe a personal question you want to ask me, in this section of the podcast, I am going to respond it. You can send me your questions via Facebook or Twitter, but you can also send me your questions using the comment section in the iTunes Store. You only need to give us a review, your opinion of this podcast. You can give us 1 star or 5 stars. It's your decision. I am going to give priority to the questions that you send through the iTunes Store. So, if you really want to make sure that I answer your question, make sure that you send me your question using that section. You only need to go to the iTunes Store, find Free Talks Podcast, and in the review section, you give us a review, you make me a question, and in the next episode, I will answer that question. Okay? Well, so that is the structure of the podcast. We have 3 sections, the main topic, the pronunciation section, and the question sections. Now, what about the duration of this podcast? And also, when I am going to record this podcast for you? Well, I am going to record this podcast for you every week. So every week you are going to have a new episode. And the duration of the podcast is not going to be always the same. But I want to keep the duration of this podcast something between 10 and 15 minutes, so that you can listen to them many times. Remember, you need to listen to interesting and comprehensible things. That's this podcast. But you also need to listen a lot of times. Okay? Remember, the repetition is key. Download this podcast and listen to it every day 2 or 3 times, and you are going to see progress really, really soon. I can promise you that. Okay, so this was the introduction to the podcast. In the next episodes, we are going to start talking about some interesting topics. So don't forget to send me your suggestions and your questions. Also, don't forget to visit the webpage www.freetalkingles.com because we have a lot of content for you. Videos, articles, podcasts, and a lot of other things. Also, I created a free course for you. 8 video lessons to help you learn the best practices to really learn English in a natural and simple way. The course is completely free. So, if you, like me, love free things, go there and get your copy today. Thank you for listening to this podcast. I don't want to finish this without telling you, without reminding you that this podcast is going to happen every week. So if you want to receive all the new podcasts every week when the podcast is ready for you, you need to subscribe to this podcast. Here on the page of the podcast, you only need to click subscribe to the podcast, and then automatically every week you are going to download the podcast, and then in this way you are never going to miss any of the episodes. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for being here, and I will see you in the next episodes. And please don't forget, keep it simple. See you then.